Imagine having your entire world turned upside down in what feels like an instant, though was probably in the making for a while. Imagine watching someone you love suffer and die when it appears to you as though both the suffering and the death could have been avoided. Imagine being so fearful you don't even want to go outside, but instead stay inside your homes because it seems safer that way. Imagine spending every day with the same groups of people and then all of a sudden not being sure who you can trust and who is being safe or not, and feeling as though if you see anyone, it needs to be in secret. Imagine the kind of grief that comes from not only watching a loved one die, but also not being able to gather with the others to grieve that death and celebrate that life. Imagine not knowing who would suffer and die next, and not wanting it to be you or anyone you love, and at the same time, not being sure how to protect them. Imagine being confused about who to listen to. Are you betraying the one you love if you listen to the voices who say it didn't happen that way? Why are the stories changing? Why doesn't everyone believe the same thing? Imagine feeling like life as you know it is over. It will never be the same, and you feel a deep despair like you have never felt before. Imagine believing for the first time that there is hope because change seems possible, and there are new people every day who also want that change. And you listen to the promises of new life, and you believe them. You walk with a spring in your step because you can see the movement gaining speed, and then the leader of the movement is murdered. You have no idea who you are anymore, and if you believe in anyone or anything. Imagine watching people with power get away with murder. Imagine waking up before the sun is up and not knowing what to do other than to pay homage to the death of your friend or family member, which also means paying homage to the death of your dreams. The advantage of going while it's still dark out is that you won't run into anyone else. It's safer that way. Imagine watching your loved one being murdered in cold blood and then realizing no one will ever stand trial for the murder. While it may sound as if I am inviting you to imagine the events of the past year and beyond, I'm actually inviting you to imagine what it would have been like to be a part of the community that followed Jesus. In their book, The Last Week, Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan explain that as Christian people living in the 21st century, we have a pre-understanding of Easter, just like we do with Good Friday and Christmas. Many of us learned these stories in childhood, and this pre-understanding is what happens when you combine all of the Easter stories from the Gospels into one big story, and then see it all through the filter of preaching, teaching, hymns, and liturgy. And then we take this pre-understanding and read it back into whatever gospel we are reading. Add on to that our cultural celebrations of Easter, and it gets a little confusing. Tell me again where Jesus got the Easter eggs? Or in which gospel the bunny makes an appearance? This pre-understanding becomes important so that we can figure out what we are reading into the story. The empty tomb did not result in instant joy for those closest to Jesus. They didn't even understand it despite what Jesus had told them. They were initially sad, fearful, suspicious that someone had stolen the body, and they were definitely confused. Mary Magdalene was crying and maybe even a bit frantic over what happened to Jesus' body, the one she had so carefully prepared. Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved couldn't believe what Mary was saying, and they had to see for themselves. They run all the way to the tomb, with one of the disciples coming in first, I might add. And they saw that the tomb was empty, but they had no idea what it meant. Their response was not one of joy. We know from the stories that led up to Jesus' crucifixion that they were terrified that they too might be murdered by the state. After Mary sees Jesus, thinking he was the gardener at first, and then hears Jesus say her name, she goes and tells the others that she has seen him. Kind of like what Jonathan and Kathleen were doing with all of us. I have seen Jesus. Jesus tells Mary to tell the followers that he is going up to God. So she tells them, and of course they have no idea what that meant. They were still behind closed doors and too afraid to go out. For the first followers of Jesus, there weren't any hallelujahs or trumpets or any brass or flowers or even praise on that early morning. If anything, there was more confusion, there was grief added to grief, and more fear. Easter morning didn't instantly change that for them. During this past winter of the pandemic, one of the shows that has taken the world by storm is the Marvel show called WandaVision. Some of you have not yet started it, and it might be on your list, while others of you are partially finished, and some of you are already finished. I won't give any spoilers, despite the temptation to tell you who to watch out for. I mention it because there is a powerful scene between the two main characters, Wanda and Vision. Vision is a form of artificial intelligence, and Wanda is, well, no spoilers, but human for the most part with awesome powers. I'll leave it at that. In this particular scene, Wanda is talking about the grief of losing her parents and her brother. She tells Vision it's like a wave that keeps washing over her again and again and knocks her down when she tries to stand up, and then it just comes for her again. And she says, it's going to drown me. Vision tells her, no, it won't. She asks him how he knows, and he responds by saying, well, it can't all be sorrow, can it? He explains that he's always been alone, and so has never loved anyone, and because of that, he has never experienced loss. And then he says something that is most profound. But what is grief if not love persevering? But what is grief if not love persevering? They both gaze thoughtfully, and then the scene ends. What is grief if not love persevering? When we use our pre-understanding of Easter to read joy and praise and celebration and all good things into the story of the empty tomb in the early morning, we miss out on the grief. And when we miss out on the grief, we miss out on love persevering. We wouldn't know about Easter resurrection if it weren't for love persevering. Despite the various stories about the followers of Jesus abandoning Jesus in various ways, one thing is true. They loved Jesus with their whole lives. And today, our love continues to persevere, and we who love Jesus, we also grieve. We grieve what Jesus endured. Not because we buy into the idea that God was so angry and needed to punish someone and chose Jesus to punish and then have Jesus die on our behalf. Not that story. We understand that Jesus died because of the sin of the world, not for the sin of the world. We grieve because in addition to being God's Son, Jesus is also the archetype for all those who are murdered by empire and the collusion of the various power brokers, including sometimes church leaders. On this anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., while the trial of George Floyd's murderer is underway, and there are still no charges in the murder of Breonna Taylor, we understand perfectly how the powers of empire and collusion work together. Here's another way to say this. We grieve because in Jesus' death, we see every unnecessary death. Grief, though, is not where we land. Grief is not where we stay and put up our tents. Grief does not drown us, though the waves are real and sometimes even come at a steady pace, like we've seen in this last year. What the Easter story affirms is that Jesus lives. Even as we grieve his horrendous death, Jesus is experienced by those who knew him and gave their lives to him as alive. And Jonathan and Kathleen sang, "I will never be the same." I have seen Jesus and I will never be the same. We don't claim to understand it or know exactly how it works, but we do claim this good news. Even today, Jesus lives among us by those who persevere in love and who experience Jesus as alive. Jesus might not show up in your backyard as a gardener and then say your name, giving you this amazing moment. Instead, it's more likely that Jesus will show up when you and your neighbors get a hold of a refrigerator and put it outside and stock it with food and invite anyone who needs food to come and take whatever they need. It's more likely that Jesus shows up when someone on your block buys 8 rolls of toilet paper and then learns that stores are out of it and puts 7 rolls outside and invites the neighbors who need one to take a roll. Jesus shows up when you take some or all of your stimulus money and donate it where it's needed if you already have enough. Jesus shows up when you say yes to providing housing to people who are unhoused, even if that means increasing your own risk of COVID. Jesus shows up when someone seeking asylum needs housing and a community, and you say yes thinking you're helping that person. And then you realize over time that person is actually helping you. He was willing to give his life to treat people who needed a physician when no one else would treat them. So all of a sudden you begin to consider what or who you would be willing to risk your life for. Jesus shows up when faith communities choose risk over safety for the right reasons. Jesus shows up every time another person chooses sobriety and community. Jesus shows up when white people talk openly and honestly about the material benefits that come from Christian and white supremacy, and then when they work to rebalance the wealth. If we will but look, we will see Jesus. The earliest followers who could touch him and have their feet washed by him and see his hands break the bread and see and hear him cry, their grief is deep. They had to watch his body be tortured and executed on the cross. They are, in words that we use today, traumatized. They are still traumatized that morning before the sun came up when Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. You cannot turn grief and trauma into joy and praise in an instant. It just doesn't happen. Healing takes time. And that's what we miss about this first Easter morning, as we now call it. What the Easter story also affirms is that God said yes to Jesus and no to the powers of empire and collusion. We may not think that has any bearing on our lives today, but it does. Jesus represented radical love and radical hope. The Roman Empire represented torture and death and fear and hatred and the actions of the powerful when they feel threatened. To say, as we just did, that Jesus lives among us and continues to live among us is to claim that death could not separate us from Jesus. With Jesus resurrected, however we understand that, God claimed that God's power could overcome the powers of evil. We live in a Good Friday world, but what does that mean when we love a God whose power is more powerful than evil and death? It means that when we think we will drown, when we think grief is going to knock us down once and for all, the vision of God says, no, it won't. And we realize God's love for us will persevere, as will our love for God and self and neighbor and enemy. We do not belong behind locked doors, but out in the world where radical love is lived. Friends, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? Jesus is not here, but has been raised to new life and is with us always. As the first followers of Jesus eventually understood, we can't stay behind our closed doors forever. The world is waiting for people who believe and live as though God's power is far more powerful than the powers of evil in the world. At some point after Easter morning, the followers of Jesus recognized that the Spirit of Jesus was alive and well and with them in tangible ways, and they were never the same. They did as Jesus taught them, and they went out beyond their comfort zones, and they created communities where people were loved and cared for, and shared housing and food and money and responsibilities in common. Many of them lost their lives for doing so. And the world was changed. And we are changed because of that. We are the ones who now carry on this radical love and this radical hope. What is grief, after all, if not love persevering? Amen.